Good evening. It's good to be with you tonight. I hope you're doing well. It's great to get to come together and worship. Every time I'm with all of you, I just remember how special of a time that is, and I hope that you feel the same way every time we get together and meet. As Stephen said, this is our last week in the life of David, and I've been excited to share these stories with you. I'm sad to see this series go by. I hope that you've enjoyed it as much as Stephen and I have. There are just so many good stories in the life of David. So many things that we can talk about. The good things that we've seen David do, the bad things we've seen David do that hopefully we can learn from, the difficulties that David has had to endure. I just think that there's a lot of stuff in these stories that we can take, and we even today, many years later, can still use and learn from. And tonight's story, I think, is one of the best stories in David's life because it shows us how David's pursuit of God's heart has began to change his own character, to transform his heart. And it shows us how, as he follows after God, David begins to mirror God's heart. Those things start to shed on David as well. And tonight, our story begins, what we're talking about, at a gate. Now, David sits between the inner and the outer gate, and he waits for a message. There's a battle going on. David is not supposed to be at the battle. His men didn't want him there. David's a little bit concerned because when David doesn't show up for the battle, bad things tend to happen. His anxiety is building up. He asks himself, will there be any messengers today? What kind of news will they bring? David can hear his own heartbeat throbbing in his ear. The watchman up above him at the gate calls out finally, I can see someone. The soldiers have told David to stay back, but now he's going to hear word of what's been going on in the battle that's raging. He's going to discover if his men were successful in their mission or not. And the watchman sees a second runner, and David knows now that news will soon come to him. He will know very soon. And he will know if this is a night for celebration or if it's a night for mourning. The first messenger arrives, and he gives David the news. Blessed be the Lord your God, who has delivered you up from the men who raised their hand against my lord the king. Well, David appreciates that news, but it's not the news that he's looking for, not what he's hoping to hear. So he asks his messenger, what has become of his enemy? Well, the messenger's a little rattled by this. That wasn't the response he was expecting from David. And he tells David, I'm not sure what's happened to the enemy. So a second runner arrives, and he gives David the same good news as the first runner. But David doesn't care about that news. He seeks another bit of information. And so he asks this second runner, is it well with the young man Absalom? And the second runner looks at the first runner as if to say, why didn't you tell him? And so the second messenger tells David plainly, may the enemies of my lord the king and all who rise up against you for evil be like that young man. Your son Absalom, who rose up against you, David, is dead. And just like that, David's heart drops about to his stomach. His hands are shaking. He retreats to a room that's up above the gate where he sat. And he cries out, oh, my son Absalom, my son Absalom. Would that I had died instead of you, O Absalom, my son, my son. To understand what David is feeling tonight as he sits beneath the gate and later rest above it, we need to step back and see how we got to this point. So last week, if you were here, Stephen talked about David and Bathsheba. You might remember that when Nathan the prophet confronts David after that incident, that he tells David the sword will never depart from David's house, that there will be evil from within David's own house that will rise up to challenge him. And almost immediately after that, we see things begin to get worse for David. David's son Absalom begins by killing one of his brothers, one of David's other sons. And eventually David forgives him for this and brings him up out of exile. But Absalom has bigger plans for himself. He leads a coup against David, with David's nephew, Amasa, as his commander. And the elders of Judah side with Absalom as well, so David is forced to flee Jerusalem for his life. And on his way out of Jerusalem and across the Jordan, David's going to run into a string of very bad encounters. The first is when David runs into Ziba. Now, there are a lot of names in tonight's story, but you might recall Ziba from a couple weeks ago when we talked about Mephibosheth. He was the one who was supposed to take care of Mephibosheth's lands because Mephibosheth, the son of Jonathan, was crippled. Well, he comes out to meet David, and he tells David that Mephibosheth will not be leaving Jerusalem with him. He tells David that Mephibosheth has sided with David's traitorous son. He tells him also that one of David's great advisors has followed after Absalom. And as David continues to run, David will run into another man, this time a man named Shimei, who comes to curse him and throws stones at David and his men as they run by. Shimei was a Benjamite. You see, he was a kinsman of Saul. And he saw this fleeing that David was forced to endure as retribution from God against David for David having outed Saul's family from the throne. God's justice was finally coming upon David as far as Shimei saw. And all of these things just keep happening to David. He keeps running into people like this. He keeps receiving bad news. He arrives on the other side of the Jordan, and he's happy there that he's greeted by some of the Israelites who still view him as their king. He's provided for. But other than that, can you imagine how David feels at this point? Betrayed by family, betrayed by his friends. He's hated by his countrymen. Potentially he feels guilty for these things, knowing that this was a prophecy that came after he had committed some sins earlier on in these stories. You know, it can't be lost on David that when this battle takes place, and a battle he knows will take place, that the armies on both sides will be led by people of his family. His son and his nephew will fight against his other nephew, Joab, who we talked about in some of these other weeks. And that will decide the fate of his kingdom. And when that battle does occur, David is not allowed to go out with his men. They are concerned about him, and they don't want him to be hurt or injured in this battle. And so they leave him where we saw him tonight, at the gate. But David tells them all before they leave to go out to battle one very important thing. He charges all of the men of his army, "Do not harm my son Absalom." David wants to reconcile with his son. But Joab does not think that that's in the king's best interest. When David's army wins the battle, Joab is told that Absalom is hanging by his long, flowing locks from a tree. The text says that he is hanging suspended between heaven and earth. You could say that Absalom is in a hairy situation here. That's a really bad joke, don't worry about it. Joab wants to take care of business while he still can, and so he goes to Absalom, and he knows what David's commanded, but nonetheless, Joab kills Absalom. So now David's nephew kills David's son in a strange way to try and preserve David's kingdom. And Joab knows that David will not be happy about it, so he sends a messenger out in front of him, one who will tell David the news before he arrives. And the first one who arrives, we actually are told that he sends two messengers, the two that we saw at the gate tonight. The first one who arrives actually was the second one to leave, and he had to beg Joab to let him go. You see, he was a young boy who was in the army, and he wanted to be useful. He told Joab, "I want to run, and I want to go out, and I want to give this message to David, this great message that we've won the battle." Well, Joab likes the poor boy, so he tries to tell him, "You don't want to be the one to deliver this news." Joab tries to dissuade him, but he's unable to do so, and so he allows him to run. That boy who was so happy to bring the news to David, when he arrives, seems to lose his voice. Seeing what David really cares about is not the battle, the boy doesn't tell David the news. And so when that second messenger comes, when the truth is told to David, we see that his reaction is not what the men in his army, what the people around him would expect. And this is how we arrived at the gate tonight. And now David sits above the gate in a room crying, much to the surprise of everyone who is in his army. But should they be surprised? Should they really be surprised, the people of David's army, that he's mourning for his son? that he's inconsolable. Now, I don't have children, but I think that this is a pretty standard reaction, isn't it? I mean, I imagine that if my parents were given the option between never seeing me again and getting an opportunity to reconcile something that I had done, that they would always choose the latter no matter what I had done. I imagine that most of you here tonight feel that same way. So why does David's army seem so shocked by David's reaction? Now, I don't know that I have a good answer to that question. I can't tell you why they're so shocked, but I can tell you what they do. Whenever they hear that David's mourning, their reaction is that day, the victory that day was turned into mourning for all the people. Because all the people heard that day that David was grieving for his son. And the people stole into the city that day as people steal in who are ashamed when they flee in battle. That's what they did. The men hear that David is mourning and they start to panic. They don't know whether they're supposed to mourn with David or celebrate because they've won a great battle. So they do what anyone in that situation would do. They start stealing stuff and start looking for places that they can relocate, start fresh. The men, we're told, are ready to desert David. They just can't comprehend the way that he's acting. And then Joab gets wind of it. He hears about what David's doing. And he walks into that room where David is, and he's ready to set David straight. He tells him, "You have today covered with shame the faces of all of your servants, who have this day saved your life and the lives of your sons and daughters, and the lives of your wives and your concubines, because you love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. For you have made it clear today that commanders and servants are nothing to you. For today I know that if Absalom were alive and all of us were dead, then you would be pleased." Joab tells David like it is. The men are going to leave you, David, if you don't get it together. They can tell that you don't love them, that you wouldn't care like this if it were them who had died. You love those who hate you, and you hate those who love you. That's what Joab tells him. And those are some harsh words, aren't they? We see what we expect to be a pretty natural response to losing a child from David just get completely torn apart by Joab, who's having none of it. He accuses David of playing favorites, only caring about his son Absalom, not caring about all these others. And so David finds his way back to where he started tonight. He goes back down to the gate. He sits there in his spot. And all of the men of his army come and they surround him as their king. And from here, David will go back to Jerusalem. He will reclaim his kingdom. He will sit comfortably on his throne. But David takes issue, or at least his actions seem to suggest that he takes issue with what Joab has to say about him. Where Joab sees an ungrateful king who is neglecting his own men, David is just looking and seeing a son that he will never get the chance to accept back. David waited at the gate, hoping for a chance. And now that chance will never come. And I think that this is the best story for us to tell tonight as we close out on our series on David because of what happens next. Because of what David does on his way back to Jerusalem. You know, David has come a long way in our series. And I think that what he's going to do tonight is going to show us that. David is no longer just the man who receives God's blessings and offers God thankfulness for those things. Those are good things, but David has graduated on past that. David tonight is going to show that he is now one whose character matches that of his God. David embodies the love of the God who has shown him love. And that is what David's going to do whenever he grieves for Absalom. That's what he's doing here. He's displaying a godly love for his child. He's not playing favorites. Joab accuses him of showing favoritism, but David's display, we will soon see, is not one that is reserved just for his son. What we see as David treks back to Jerusalem is that David has chased God's heart for so long that David's heart is beginning to take that same shape. The same reconciliation that David desired to have with Absalom is going to be given to all of those who have wronged David. You say, Joab, that I love those who hate me, and I hate those that love me. Well, one of those things at least is true, David says. David first sends word to the elders of Judah that he's going to come back. He lets them know that he doesn't hold a grudge against them for siding with Absalom. In verse 12 of chapter 19, David says, "You are my brothers. You are my bone and my flesh. And then he sends word to his nephew Amasa, who you might remember was the commander in Absalom's army. Now you would think that David would want to get back at him, right? Maybe he blames Amasa for siding with his cousin, David's son, and inadvertently causing Absalom's death. No. In fact, David sends word to Amasa and he tells him that he will now be the commander of David's army instead of Joab. And can you imagine that? You serve as the commander of the enemy of the king, the one who tries to overthrow him, and you are punished by becoming the commander of the king's army. David is showing mercy. He's showing compassion. David wants to reconcile, if at all possible, with those who have wronged him. And that meant Absalom, and it means those who sided with him. So David's accepted by his countrymen, and he arrives at the Jordan. He's going to cross the Jordan and come back into Judah. And here he is met by Shimei, the man who threw rocks at him and said that David deserved his fate because of what he had done to the house of Saul. Shimei brings 1,000 men with him down to the river to greet David as he comes in. And you might hear that and expect that a fight's about to break out because of what's happened before. But that's actually the opposite of what we see here. Shimei fell down before the king as he was about to cross the Jordan, and he said to the king, "Let not my lord hold me guilty, or remember how your servant did wrong on the day that my lord the king left Jerusalem. Do not let the king take it to heart, for your servant knows that I have sinned." Shimei comes to David, and he asks for his forgiveness. But surely David won't forgive what Shimei has done to him, right? All the horrible things that he said about David while David was in one of his most trying times. Well, that's what David's men think anyway. We see that they still haven't learned. Joab's brother, who in fact is another nephew of David, a lot of familial relations here, Abishai, he looks to David and he says, "Shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed?" Now that sounds like something that a young David would say, doesn't it? Something that we've heard before whenever David was defending Saul's honor. But David turns and rebukes him. You see, Abishai is ready to exact vengeance for these things that have been done. But David is not going to put up with that. I think that here we see the difference in character between Joab and his siblings and their uncle David. Because David's going to say to him, "What have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah, that you should this day be as an adversary to me? Shall anyone be put to death in Israel this day? For do I not know that I am the king this day in Israel?" And the king said to Shimei, "You shall not die." And the king swore an oath by him. David hits back at Abishai and Joab's sense of justice. After all, David has surely heard the rumors, right? David knows that these are not the only ones who have sinned against him. He's probably heard what happened on the battlefield, that Joab went against a direct command from him. David looks at them and he says, "Do you think that I forgot who I am?" David knows that he's the king. He knows what Shimei has done. He knows what Joab and the others have done. But David is uniquely positioned to extend mercy. And he reminds those who want him to enact justice that the choice is ultimately his to make. And what does David choose but to love those who hate him? The very thing that Joab has accused him of earlier on in this story. Isn't that what he has done with every character that he's come across that we've seen tonight? David's desire to reconcile did not end with Absalom. It extends to all of those who have wronged him. Shall anyone be put to death this day in Israel? Well, not if David has anything to say about it. You know, the last person David meets in our story tonight is in the city of Jerusalem. It's a person whose betrayal must have hurt David almost as much as Absalom's. It's Mephibosheth, that crippled son of Jonathan, who David had brought into his house and treated as his own son. The man who David was told had seen David's demise, and he had thought that he was going to gain from it. The one who had stayed behind in Jerusalem. This Mephibosheth comes to David, and you can tell that David's hurt because he says to him, "Why did you not go with me, Mephibosheth?" You know, in a time when many people would lash out in anger, David pauses, collects himself, and he listens to what Mephibosheth has to say. And what he says is, "David, it was all a trick. My lord, O king, my servant Ziba deceived me. For your servant said to him, I will saddle my donkey for myself, that I may ride on it and go to the king, for your servant's lame. But Ziba has slandered your servant to my lord the king. But my lord the king is like an angel of God. Do therefore what seems good to you. For all my father's house were but men doomed to death before my lord the king. But you set your servant among those who eat at your table. What further right have I then to cry to the king? Mephibosheth tells David, I wanted to go with you, David, but I was betrayed. You know, Ziba tricked me. He told you that I was against you. But notice that Mephibosheth doesn't ask David for anything here. He tells David to do whatever he needs to do. Basically, Mephibosheth tells him, I accept whatever punishment there needs to be for this thing, even though I've done no wrong. I'll accept your judgment because you have already done more for me, David, than anyone would have ever expected. David's having none of that, just so you know. He cuts off Mephibosheth. Why speak any more of your affairs? I have decided you and Ziba will split the land. David doesn't know who's telling the truth, Mephibosheth or Ziba. But David doesn't seem to care about who's telling the truth. We can assume that he trusts Jonathan's son, but at the end of the day, he just does the most judicious thing. He splits the land. Rather than punishing either one of them, he decides to try and do right by both of them. And Mephibosheth responds by telling David to give it all to Ziba. I'm just happy that you came back, David. Give it all to him. I don't care about the land. I just care about you. Further causing us to believe that he probably was innocent. But this is about what David does here. David is not concerned about who's deceived him. Although clearly one of these two has deceived him. One of them has betrayed him. He's not concerned with that. David wants to make peace with anyone who will have it. He's not interested in slaughtering his enemies this day. He is focused on bringing every single person that he can back into his fold. And you know, to Joab, maybe that looks like David loving those who hate him. Maybe it looks like David is not rewarding those who have faithfully followed him around. Maybe Joab has a right to say, why do you care about that person when we've been the ones who followed you through thick and thin, David? But what we really see here is that David is a man chasing after God's own heart who has found a piece of it, and he's made that his own. David has lived through his own reconciliation process. And now he is equipped to live out reconciliation for others, whether that be his son, his nephew, his adversary, his friend. David is equipped for that. David is showing what it looks like to be a man after God's own heart after years of chasing it. And to those around David, when he mourns for Absalom, when he forgives Shimei, when he acts justly with Mephibosheth, it looks like David has lost his mind. It looks like he is out of touch with reality. He doesn't understand how a kingdom works and is run. It looks like he hates those who love him, and he loves those who hate him. But you know, in our Bible, we have a lot of stories. Joab is not the last character in one of the stories in our Bible to show disdain whenever reconciling love is extended to those that maybe aren't deserving of it. Depends on who the beholder is, I guess. We read in the New Testament about a father who, rather than sitting in his house, he sits at the gate, sits on the porch, however you want to say it, who actually sees his son from afar and he runs out to meet him. When the son tries to apologize to his father and tell him about his plans to make it right, he cuts him off. He calls for a celebration because the lost son, the one who had forsaken him, has come home. The father is bursting at the seams with reconciling love to extend to his lost son. But in that story, a Joab lurks nearby. This one won't even go into the father's house, but rather he stands outside showing his disdain for his formerly lost brother, maybe even a cousin. And the father comes out to that older son and he pleads with him to come in, to share in the celebration of his returned brother. But the older son, like Joab, is indignant. By showing love to him, Father, what you're showing me is that you hate me. When you love him in this way, It shows me that you must not care for me." The father pats his son on the shoulder, looks him in the eye, and he tells him, "You've got it all wrong. Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But it was fitting to celebrate and to be glad. For this your brother was dead and is alive. He was lost, but now he's found." The prodigal has come back, and we had no choice, the father says, but to celebrate his return. Now, if that parable of Jesus is told to inform us of how God feels about his children, then David seems to be sending a similar message, doesn't he? If reconciliation is possible, then it must be pursued at all cost. And if it's not possible, then it must be desired above all things. This is how God views his children. And it's how David views not only his child in this story, but his friends and his adversaries as well. David has learned his God's heart. And once again, we can see that in his songs, in the Psalms that he writes. We read from Psalm 103 tonight as we began, and I want to read just a piece of it again together. "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. The Lord works righteousness and justice for all who are oppressed. He made his ways known to Moses, his acts to the children of Israel. The Lord is merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. He will not always chide, nor will he keep his anger forever. He does not deal with us according to our sins, nor repay us according to our iniquities. For as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his steadfast love towards those who fear him. As far as the east is from the west, so far does he remove our transgressions from us. As a father shows compassion to his children, so the Lord shows compassion to those who fear him. For he knows our frame. He remembers that we are dust." David didn't know the story of the prodigal son like you and I do. But David lived that story for himself. And we see that in the way that he so accurately portrays God's redemptive love and his desire to make all right that has been done wrong. But David is not alone in this. Just like David, I think, has lived this story, I believe that you and I live it out today as well. Maybe you find yourself in the shoes of the lost son tonight. Maybe you have gone away from your father. Maybe you believe that he's too demanding, or maybe he was too controlling. Maybe you used to think those things, but now you're on your way home because you don't think them anymore. Maybe you're trying to find your way back to him and you just haven't arrived yet. If you believe the words of David tonight, then you must believe that the Father is waiting at the gate. He's watching for you. That he will run to you with open arms and he will remove your transgressions. As far as the east is from the west, he will remember them no more. If that describes you tonight, then come back to him. He never tires of his reconciling, redemptive love. But maybe you find yourself in the shoes of the older brother tonight. Maybe you have felt unappreciated for some time by those you love. Maybe you feel like that love that they show to others who are just not as loyal to them as you are somehow in some way negates the love that they have for you. Maybe you refuse to accept your brother because of the things that they've done. Maybe, like Joab, you would do whatever you can to keep your brother from making his way back into the fold, from returning home. That's not the life that the Father has envisioned for you. Soften your heart. Rest in the assurance that God loves you and that the Father's love for others can never take away from the love that He has for you. Don't feel threatened, but rather, welcome your siblings back. Show them the love that your Father shows you every day. You know, I don't know where you fit into the story tonight, but I can tell you where David fits. From the time that David is called from the sheep pen, watching over those sheep as a young shepherd, David is seen to be chasing after God's heart. He is following the Father as closely as he can. Now, sometimes he turns away, like that younger brother. And sometimes he makes self-righteous judgments and decisions like that older brother, pushes others away. But whatever David is doing, we see a man who is chasing after his God, a man who desires to know his God's, his Father's heart. And I think that that image of chasing is a good one, because the God that we see in stories like the prodigal son is a God who is on the move, constantly seeking to bring back the strays, to bind up the weak. He's a God who seeks to reconcile with those who have gone astray because of His great love for them. And those who chase after Him, like David, will begin to run like He does to all of those who need His redemption. They will run out before Him. They will extend grace on His behalf. Those who find reconciliation in the heart of God have no choice but to extend that grace to others. I pray tonight that wherever you find yourself, that you'll chase after God's heart, like David, and in doing so, that you will find it so that you may share it with those who are in need of God's reconciling love. As we leave tonight, I pray that it may be said of us that we love those who hate us. Wouldn't that be a great thing? Without it being said that we hate those who love us. May we urge each other on as we chase after the heart of God together. If you have any need of reconciliation tonight, we ask that you run now to the heart of the God who loves you as we stand and sing.